All right, so we're gonna do a little bit of a review of some gear that I rented from lensrental.com. I had to pay for the rental, so it's not like it was sponsored or anything. But I rented an A7R2 and an A6500. Why don't we start with the A6500? So get this out of the way. And so this is the A6500. It is my first experience at all with a Sony camera, and the lens I have on it is a full frame 28mm, so it probably shoots f.2, and it probably shoots like 35mm field of view on this camera. First thing that stands out to me is basically this grip. I was actually shooting this camera earlier today with a beast of a lens, the Zeiss Batis 85mm 1.8, and the grip actually worked out really well. I can get my paws on this thing. Other things that stand out is that there's only really one dial, nothing up here, nothing back here, and you need to use this dial here mostly for the shutter, while you use this one for the f-stop. So not a huge fan of that. Ergonomics on this in terms of controls are pretty slow, but the from a shooting perspective, the thing that stood out the most is that the camera is actually very, very fast. Pretty quick to start up, or at least coming from an Olympus OMD EM5, I didn't notice anything. And if you get into the menus here, you know, this is what we're dealing with, but basically I set it up to back button focus with this button here. I set this top C1 to switch between the EVF and the LCD because I found the sensor actually to be a little bit too sensitive, and so it was never really doing what I wanted it to do. C2 I have to change focus modes. Let's see what else. ISO I kept the same. C3 I actually used for silent shutter in case I ever needed that, but wasn't a huge fan of it, so I may switch that up. Overall, I'll put some photos or show some of the results of both video and photo shooting. And you know, this is an interesting camera. It's actually good enough that I might consider for kind of overlooking the ergonomics and using the camera anyway, just because I like the ASP-c sensor. It gets me a little bit more than the OMD EM5 does now. The other lenses I shot this with are the 35 1.8 OSS, and then just because I was in a bit of a hurry, I threw it on the full frame. But here the 50mm 1.8. Let's switch gears here a little bit and look at some sample video footage. This is with the A6500 and what looks like, I think it's the Batis 85mm, and it's at the, I think it was the Chinese New Year parade in Chinatown in New York. If you try to stay really still, you can get a stable shot, but here with the pigeons, you can see it was still a little bit finicky. So there's definitely some, not trouble with the Ibis, but the Ibis is really maybe not as good as the Ibis on the original EM5. Obviously, I'm not very good at shooting video with this thing yet, so we got some exposure trouble there as it tries to do auto exposure. Next, I wanted to test out how the Ibis did when walking, and so I had a GoPro, you can see how I was kind of hand holding the a6500, and then we can switch to the actual footage coming from the a6500 while walking. And as you can see, that footage isn't anywhere near what you would get from, say, the OMD EM1 Mark II from Olympus. Next, we can do more of a pan. As you can see here, I'm panning from left to right, just holding the camera out in front of me. Now for the footage on the a6500, the pan is passable, but you can still see that the Ibis isn't super stable. It's not something that I'd probably want to use in a video production. Now let's switch into some photography. So I was just kind of walking around a nearby neighborhood and shooting different shots of kind of street scenes that looked interesting. And what we can do here is I'll show some of the shots in RAW, or actually I'll just show a sampling of some of the shots, and then I'll show some of the shots in RAW kind of right out of the camera, and then I'll show some of those shots edited in Photoshop just so people can get an idea of what I was able to do with this camera. In the end, the camera was relatively compact. The big kind of beefy grip made it actually a real joy to use even with bigger lenses like the 85 Batis. I found the camera actually super fast and very responsive when it came to photography. The only holdup being the ergonomics don't make it really all that easy to configure or change settings quickly. On the video side, the quality looks good. I obviously still need to learn a lot about how to use it. But on the Ibis side, I'm not sure Sony really is ready to compete with Panasonic or, Olympus, but it doesn't even seem like they really compete yet with Panasonic, as the stability or the stabilization on this just isn't good enough to be shooting handheld in most scenarios. I think the Batis has stabilization, so I'm not sure yet if they're supposed to work together and be even more stabilized. I'll have to look into that. Anyway, there you have it. There's the review of the a6500. Awesome still image quality, great video quality. Probably isn't something I'd want to use without some sort of gimbal.